Welcome back to Taekwondo. This is lesson number 32, the Brown Belt lecture, which is on Bushido, codes, and tenets. These are your learning objectives. We're going to do a comparison lecture where we discuss these things because they're really more like guidelines as opposed to rules. During this time period, codes were quite common. In Europe, we had the Code of Chivalry, wherein you feared God, you protected the downtrodden, you respected women. These things came from something called the Song of Roland, and they were edified into Western culture as chivalrous conduct, and you still see remnants of it to this day when you hold a door open for a lady. Let's look at the Bushido Code and Tenets of Taekwondo. Let's start by defining some things. First of all, a belief. A belief is a mental acceptance of a conviction in the truth, actuality, or validity of something as being real. If we look at the term code, a code is basically a system of principles or rules. It's a systematic statement of a body of law, especially one given to statutory force. The last is a tenet. And a tenet is this idea of a principal belief or doctrine generally held to be true, especially one held in common by members of an organization, a movement, or a profession. According to Webster, this is the definition of a warrior. Teddy Roosevelt is someone who is very well known in our culture as a warrior, and he was very enamored with Inazo Nitobei's book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan. If you haven't read it, you should, because this is the reason why Bushido became very popularized in the early 19th century. Roosevelt wrote this man in the arena. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how strong men stumble, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without great error and shortcoming, but who comes actually to strive to do these deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly. So it is his place wherein you shall never see the cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Teddy Roosevelt. The Japanese stunned the world at the end of the Russo-Japanese War because the small island of Japan had defeated a very powerful Western power, Russia. This war had a great influence on martial arts. Morihei Ueshiba, the father of Aikido, actually fought in that war. Also at about that same time, Inazo Nitobei published his book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan. That book was read by Teddy Roosevelt and had a great deal of influence on Teddy Roosevelt's understanding of the Japanese. This is a picture of Teddy Roosevelt with the Russian and Japanese folks at their surrender ceremony. It's also interesting that through the consul from Japan, Roosevelt was familiar with Hirobumi Ito, the Japanese Governor General of Korea, who you know from Chunggun fame. Let's discuss belief systems. A belief system is an organized way of thinking that helps people to understand why we exist within the universe. Codes are not something specifically unique to Japan. We have a code in the United States Army that's called the Military Code of Conduct. In Section 1, I am an American, fighting in the forces which guard my country and our way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. All veterans write a check to and include their life. Let's talk about Bushido, a code of conduct. In Inazo Nitobei's book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan, He had actually done some soul searching himself. The question that had come to him was, how do you inculcate character and morality to your children if you don't specifically have a religion to follow? The result was Inazo Nitobei's award-winning book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan. Within that book, he makes great insight into martial arts, where he compares it to a turnip. His note is that a turnip is rather pedantic. You have to boil it over and over and over again before it is fit for consumption. If we look at the roots of Bushido date back to the Kamakura period and even previous to that, during the Genpei Wars. It was during these wars that various codification ideas came out, and there was a book written that was called The Tale of Heiki. It was about the battles between the Minamoto and the Taira warriors. It was compiled by a blind monk whose name was Koichi. The Bushido, which were the rules of combat, were essentially established during that time period of war. And the Goyo Kokan, which is where Bushido was first coined, actually began to articulate some of the Bushido code. There are, however, numerous other codes. Let's look at the 8 virtues of Bushido. The first is Gi, or justice. In our system, justice is blind, and we base prosecution and or innocence based off of evidence. Next is the idea of courage, the second characteristic of the code. Courage, according to Plato, is knowing what not to fear, like going to Japan to train in Aikido with people you don't know. Jin, or compassion. This is the third trait. Compassion is almost like empathy, wherein you can feel something for someone else. It literally means to feel with and to suffer with everyone around you. Rei is this idea of respect. At the beginning of each class, we say Kesuke, Rei, where we bow to one another to show mutual respect and also to those who went before us. Makato is this idea of integrity. Integrity, in my opinion, is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. And that's a quote by C.S. Lewis. Next, let's talk about Meiho, which is honor. Honor is really a compilation of 3 things. I think selflessness, humility, and truthfulness are truly the signs and or hallmarks of an honorable man. Chugi, or duty. Duty is something that's quite well known to most soldiers and most police officers. When we are doing our duty, whether we like it or not, we are trying to enforce rules of honor and rules of society. Jisei is self-control. Self-control, I think, is really part of the idea of success. Sometimes when we don't want to work out and we force ourselves to work out, those can be the best training periods that we've ever had. Let's talk about the Akko Vendetta and the 47 Ronin. The best stories are often true stories. The story of the 47 Ronin has been retold in movies by Kurosawa and also the Keanu Reeves movie, which is relatively newer. But within this story, Lord Asano and Lord Kira in court have a confrontation over courtly culture. Lord Asano, who was a great samurai, had been assigned Lord Kira as a guide, and it was Lord Kira's job to get him up to speed on courtly manners. That confrontation and Lord Asano drawing his sword led to Lord Asano being ordered to commit seppuku, or ritual suicide, in order to redeem his honor. That meant that his samurai would then become Ronin, which would be masterless samurai. The story of the 47 Ronin is a story of revenge, a story of intrigue, and a story of honor, and specifically focuses around the Japanese culture of seppuku, or harakiri, which means to open the belly in order to prove that you are still an honorable person. Next up, let's talk a little bit about the tenets of Taekwondo and how they relate to this idea of Bushido and a codification of rules. Within Taekwondo, we have the 5 tenets of Taekwondo. The first is courtesy, or ya-li. Courtesy is this idea of showing respect to one another, being polite, being on time, being neat, clean, and ready for class and ready for training. We show respect to one another through bowing, or what the Japanese call rei. The next tenet in Taekwondo is the idea of integrity. That means if you say something and you're going to do it, then you do it. You can be counted upon doing what is right, even when people are not watching. Integrity is in Korean called yon-chi. Yon-chi. The next tenet of Taekwondo, number 3, is perseverance. I like the story of Fudoshin, which is the ongoing, ever-persistent mind of a martial arts master. And when I think of persistence, which in Korean is o-i-inye, I can think of no one who represents persistence better than Bill Superfoot Wallace, who has been training his entire life and continues to train and set an example. Next is self-control. Self-control means controlling your emotions, controlling your anger, and in Korean it is called guk-gi. And it's this idea that you are going to tell yourself to do something. It's like in the military when you're marching. Your feet won't stop until your brain tells them to. Next is the idea of an indomitable spirit. Bok-chur-bur-ku. That's this idea that you want to have a spirit that's very strong. One of the things that's interesting in the military or in a POW setting is when there's a minister or priest available to the prisoners, it helps to improve their spirit and they become much stronger. Let's talk a little bit about Bushido in the 19th century. And a good place to start is with a history lesson. At a time, both Korea and Japan were isolationist states. In fact, Korea was known as the Hermit Kingdom. And Japan was much the same. They wanted to be isolationist. And it was really this influence from Western powers that ended the Sakaku, which is this idea of the period of isolation. It was in the 1850s that this gentleman, Admiral Perry, cruised into Yokohama Harbor and essentially forced the Japanese to open up their ports to trade with the Western powers and with the United States. Korea was also forced to open up its borders because it had been known as the Hermit Kingdom. Around 1910, the Japanese would press into and annex Korea as part of the Japanese Empire at that time. Gichin Funakoshi, who was teaching Shorin-ryu, which meant Shaolin school, would influence many Koreans, which would eventually lead to the development of Taekwondo, and you'll see huge influences from Shorin-ryu in the martial art of Taekwondo. This is Hirobumi Ito of Chung Gun Hyung fame. So Bushido, or the way of the warrior, was something that O-sensei, the founder or father of Aikido, felt was being perverted by the Japanese military. It's interesting that O-sensei was influenced in Manchuria, where he did travels with his spiritual guide, Onisaburo Deguchi. They were actually captured and imprisoned in Manchuria, and it was only through negotiations at a high level with Japan that both of them were able to succeed and get their freedom. It's interesting to note that O-sensei was hidden during World War II at a time by his students, who were actually police officers within a province, from federal police officers who were looking for him because he felt the way that the Bushido rules were being perverted and the way that martial influences were being used was incorrect. He felt that the way of the warrior was to establish harmony, not to go to war. He often referred to this idea of going back to your beginner's mind, or the idea of Shoshin. During the pre-war era, many of the codes of the samurai had almost been forgotten. Bushido had been resurrected, and this idea of using it as a propagandizement in order to motivate the male population to war was something that was done specifically by members of the army in Japan. Let's talk a little bit about the 3 R's: resources, race, and religion, the 3 main causes of war. The reason the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor was primarily over resource allocation. In other words, oil. They needed oil in order to continue their war machine, and hence they gave the order to climb Mount Nitaka. That order given, climb Mount Nitaki, would lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th. It is interesting to note that there was a difference between the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy. The Army, which was led by Hidetake Tojo, primarily was a conscript military, and they were less influenced by the values of samurai teachings than was the Navy. So you could expect to get better treatment if you were captured by the Japanese Navy. You see many influences by the Japanese Navy, such as the kamikaze, or the divine wind, the suicide bombers, who pledged their life in defense of their homeland and their infamous bravery. This is a picture of a kamikaze pilot. Let's talk a little bit about the book Unbroken and Lou Zamperini. Zamperini was an Olympic runner. He ran in the 1936 Games. He actually got to see Adolf Hitler at those games. He would eventually wind up in the U.S. Navy. He was flying over the Pacific when his plane went down because of mechanical issues into the ocean. He floated on the ocean for months. He managed to survive that. He was captured by the Japanese. The Navy actually treated him fairly well, and then he was turned over to the Army, where he was brutalized and tortured for the remainder of that war. Zamperini's story is a story of Bushido at its highest levels, a story of forgiveness, and a story of self-discovery and strength. Bushido, as taught to you by a U.S. Navy pilot and a survivor. So when we think about it, where does that leave us? It took the introduction of nuclear power in order to end World War II. This is a picture of the signing of the peace agreement on board the USS Missouri. It's interesting that the very first signer of the peace document was this gentleman, who had actually been a prisoner of war held by the Japanese during World War II, and his signature is the first one that was affixed to this instrument of surrender. The codes today are interesting. They're ancient codes that date back to the Kamakura period. We now understand that it was really an amalgamation of many codes and not specifically just one, and that perhaps the idea by Nitobe was a romanticized version of what he felt the code should indicate. But if you study a martial system today that ends in do, like Karate-do, Kendo, Aikido, Judo, or our Korean martial art of Taekwondo, these martial systems are designed to help you understand a way of being honorable, of good conduct, of being polite and kind, and as Master Ree would say, of having strength, might for right. A little politeness and a little courtesy goes a long way. And of course, there's always the lesson by the pirates. These more like guidelines than actual rules. Guys, thanks a lot for listening. This is Dane Harden with Dane Harden Martial Arts. Please like and subscribe. If you haven't already, please consider tuning in for lesson number 33, which will be the Brown Belt Skills session. Thanks for watching.